Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Mental Health and a co-production with Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, and today I am thrilled to have Dr. Willoughby from Brigham Young University joining me to talk about a study that was recently released in the Journal of, help me out, Dr. Willoughby.
Journal of Sex Research.
Journal of Sex Research. And it's been making the rounds in lots of different areas of the media. And want to talk about the study itself, and sometimes the media gets it right as far as the implications of research, and sometimes it really does not. So I just want to, if possible, talk to the people that are in charge of the research themselves and get their perspectives on it. So welcome to the show, and so happy to have you today.
Happy to be here.
Would you mind starting us off by just giving us a little bit of a bio? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so as you said, I am teaching at Brigham Young University. I'm an associate professor in the School of Family Life, and I specifically specialize in young adults dating and romantic relationship formation, marital relationships, and sexuality. And so I've done a fair amount of work on dating relationships, marital formation. A lot of my work in the last couple of years has been on pornography as I was exploring young adult dating patterns. This was obviously one of the things that started to come up a lot in the last decade or so. And so that got me a little bit into that area. And I've done several studies in the last 5 years that have been looking at the nature of pornography use in young adults, how it affects relationships, and just kind of the overall effect that pornography has on both individuals and couples.
So right off the bat then, why don't we just jump into the research that we're going to be talking about today. The title of your article was called Damaged Goods, Perception of Pornography Addiction as a Mediator Between Religiosity and Relationship Anxiety Surrounding Pornography Use. And I'll tell you, I'll be very honest, every time I read research articles, I always have a little bit of PTSD anxiety from my statistics class. So I'm guessing a lot of this language goes over the head of lay people as well, if it goes over my head. So so why don't we start with a little bit about what were you hoping to really hone in on as far as what was the theory, what were the questions you were trying to answer,
Right.
And maybe even, I'm guessing, you were influenced by some of the research that's already been out.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I've been doing several studies in this area for the last couple of years, and this was a study done with two of my graduate students. And I and several other scholars in this area published several studies just trying to look at the overall effect of pornography use on the individual in the relationship. And that research has been pretty consistent, where it tends to show a small negative effect on both individuals and couples. But one of the things that's come up in a lot of that research is that there seems to be a lot of nuance into what that effect looks like, how big of a negative effect it is. That tends to shift based on gender of the person. It tends to shift based on marital status, age, religiosity. So there's a lot of factors that we were seeing in our previous studies that suggested that, like I said, there's a lot of nuance into what exactly pornography is doing to the individuals. And so this was one of our first kind of follow-up studies after the last few studies looking at just the effect of pornography to try to understand some of that nuance. And in this particular study, in particular, what we wanted to look at was how pornography use is related to internal perceptions of that use. So in other words, not just what I'm doing, but how do I perceive that use? Do I think that I have an addiction? Do I think that pornography use is out of control, or do I not? And then specifically link that to something we actually haven't looked at before, which is relationship anxiety and communication anxiety. And you referenced some of the media earlier on. And one of the things the media has been consistently getting wrong about this particular study is that in this study, we actually didn't look at relationship well-being. And so this wasn't a study looking at couples in terms of sexual satisfaction or relationship satisfaction. We were looking more at the individual level. And our outcome variable was this anxiety measure. And so we're looking at do you struggle talking to other people about your pornography use? Do you struggle sharing that with other people? Do you get uncomfortable around the opposite sex, or do you find yourself avoiding dating situations when you look at pornography or after you've looked at pornography? And so it's trying to get at kind of that anxiety that I have about my own use. And then again, specifically looking at how internal perceptions, how use matters, and then also religiosity, because religiosity is something we've seen in previous research that's been related to how people think about pornography. Obviously, most religious faiths tend to have disapproving views of pornography. And so we were interested on how does that change someone's internal perception?
And that's really important because oftentimes what I see the pushback when I, for example, share this article on my Facebook page, that we start getting into conversations that are really not what the research is about. In other words, porn is good or bad, religion is good or bad, and that's not at all what we're really describing here. So people have the right to have their own religious values or ideas about pornography or sexually explicit material, just like people have their own rights to have ideas about religious cultures and their own relationship with their own religions if they have those. So that's really important, I think, to separate from what the question is that you're really asking. And so it seems to me like some of the questions that you were asking is, does anxiety play a role? Does the way that you give meaning to pornography, does that play a role? And oftentimes meanings that we do put towards pornography have some type of religious bias or cultural belief around it. And if you are then associating with a spouse or a friend or an ecclesiastical leader or anybody who's also part of that religious culture, then that may also play into some of this anxiety about talking about it. Is that fair?
Yeah, and just to give your audience a little bit more specific. So, for example, some of the items in our outcome measure we were looking at were things like, my partner would react negatively if I disclose pornography use to him or her. I've withheld details about my pornography use because I'm afraid my partner will react negatively. So that's at the core of what we were looking at, is again that kind of personal fear and personal anxiety around your use. And if you feel comfortable sharing that with other people. And like you said, is unfortunately oftentimes in our culture and in our media and a lot of the dialogue around pornography is it has become this kind of culture war issue that is very black and white. And on one side, people need every research study and everything that's ever said about pornography to show that not just that it's negative, but that everything in your life is going to be ruined as soon as someone looks at pornography the first time. And on the other side, it's pornography does nothing if not positively affects every relationship that it's in. And like pretty much everything in life, there's a lot more nuance and there's a lot more complexity to the issue. I like to give the alcohol metaphor. I know a lot of groups like to use crack cocaine or heroin or things, and I don't think that's a very good metaphor or comparison with pornography, but I think alcohol is a much more applicable comparison, where I think most people understand that alcohol use is not a black and white issue. And as you said, people of different religious beliefs and faiths have different religious and moral perceptions on alcohol use. But when it comes to use, there's a lot of nuances, a lot of complexity. It's not just a black and white. Every time someone has a glass of wine, that's not the same thing as someone who's drinking hard liquor 4 or 5 times a week.
Right. So that there's a lot of different factors. And you mentioned several of them just right off the bat: age, marital status, religiosity. Even within the same religion, you can have a huge spectrum of how seriously people take their religious expectations and things of that nature. Plus, if you add a mental health diagnosis, depression, anxiety, all of those things can obviously affect how we perceive our relational issues or our issues with ourselves. So, great. Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the process then of doing the research? So how did you get the sample? Was it mainly BYU students? Was it mainly,
that's always the first question that people ask, is this just a BYU Mormon? And no, this was not a BYU or a Mormon sample. It's one of the things I have to do as a sexuality researcher is go find my data somewhere else, because getting a highly religious sample when you're trying to do this kind of research is going to give you pretty skewed results. And so this was an online data collection effort. We actually used Amazon's mTurk database or platform, which is kind of a crowdsourcing network where you can post different jobs and research surveys that people actually across the world internationally can take. And a lot of researchers are using this mechanism now as a way to get not nationally representative data, but national or international data for kind of innovative or new ideas that they might be having, trying out different things and different measurements. And so this was a sample of several hundred individuals that we took through MTurk, and it was about evenly split between men and women. They tended to be a little bit older. Our average age was late 20s, so almost 30. Pretty even split in terms of racial background. Most of them were white, but only 60%. So we had 40% minority groups, and only 2.3% were LDS. And so that's about a little bit higher than the national average. But our largest religious affiliation was Protestant and Catholic, and then no affiliation.
And then it was mostly a questionnaire then type of study?
Yeah, so it was an online survey, and so they took the questionnaire just on their computer, and then the data was sent to us.
So can you tell us a little bit about this idea of damaged goods? Like, how did you define that? How did you come up with that language?
It's based, again, on that perception piece that was so central to this particular article. Is, again, since we were focused on someone's internal perception of their own pornography use, one of the things, and this wasn't in the actual article, this is just what we were looking at when we were getting our data back. One of the things that really stood out to us is we had this compulsivity scale, the one we used in the article, that kind of asked people, do you think you have an addiction? And then we also had a lot of behavioral measures. And so we are actually asking them, how much do you view sexually explicit material? How often in the week? And so we had enough information. I know diagnosing sexual addiction that's a whole other can of worms that we might get into in this discussion. But if you kind of take a general consensus of what sexual compulsivity and addiction might look like in terms of both behavioral control issues and compulsion issues and daily functioning issues, we saw about maybe 10 to 15% of our sample look like they were kind of fitting in that category, where they were showing, daily or almost daily use. They were showing functional impairment with that use, lack of control, those sorts of things. But when we looked at just the perception piece, so how many people in our sample actually thought that they had an addiction, it was about 2 to 3 times larger than that number. And so we saw this large group of people that were kind of self-labeling themselves as having a pornography addiction when the behavioral piece of that didn't seem like it lined up. And then what we started to see, and this is what we really got into in this article, is one of our main findings is that as people started to perceive themselves as being a porn addict, that was strongly related to this increased anxiety. And so they were also then reporting that, well, I don't feel like I can go on dates anymore. I don't feel like I can talk to my partner about that or about this particular issue. And so the damaged goods label was meant to kind of describe this feeling or this perception we were seeing with a lot of people of themselves. And so there's this sense of, because I'm labeling myself as a porn addict, I am now damaged goods in the dating market or in my marriage, and I don't feel like I can communicate, or I don't feel like I can talk or engage with other people now because of that perception, regardless of what the actual behavior might be.
Yeah, and that's very similar to the research that Josh Grubbs did, I believe. I forget out of which university, but the same results, which I see in my clinical practice all the time, right? Which translates into issues with self-esteem, relational patterns, secrecy, inability to negotiate good, healthy relationships because there's just so much shame and hidden psychology that's going on for people. It's just really harmful. Well, so do you want to talk a little bit then about what correlations do you want to make sure people don't make out of this? Because we oftentimes like to make those correlations. And then also what assumptions you would want people to take from this research.
Yeah. Well, like I was saying earlier, I think for me, the biggest thing to keep in mind is the outcome. Again, the outcome was not satisfaction or communication or depression. There wasn't a well-being indicator in the study at all. And so I actually don't think this study really has anything to say about if porn is good or bad, because that really wasn't what we were studying. It really wasn't the focus of the paper. There's lots of other research that I and others have done that have been trying to get at that particular question. This was really about, like I said, that personal anxiety. And for me, then, the correlations and the take-home messages that really matters, as I already said, we did find this very strong link between this perception of believing that I'm addicted and this anxiety around talking to people. And again, we didn't necessarily measure this in the study, but my assumption is that these individuals that are reporting, I don't feel like I can talk to my partner, I don't feel like I can date other people, that's probably having an impact on their behavior. They're probably not actually communicating with their partner. They're probably not engaging in the dating market as much as they would. And to me, what that tells me is that that's a point of potential intervention for people and education. It's telling me that I think for a lot of people, there's just not a lot of good education around this particular issue. They don't understand what addiction is. They don't understand what normative use would be, what the real effects of pornography are. There's just so much unknown for people. And then, like I said, such a lack of education that for a lot of people, they feel like, well, porn's still kind of a taboo topic. Sex is still kind of a taboo topic, even outside of a religious context. And so if I'm struggling with this or I'm worried about this, I don't think people see a lot of resources in their community that they can turn to. And I think that's unfortunate. I think for me, like I said, that's one of the big takeaways of this research is that we just need more resources and good education for people to help them both educate themselves on this issue, and for those that actually are maybe struggling with compulsive use, that they feel like, hey, I can go talk to my partner, I can go talk to people, I can go find resources. When we know from decades of relationship research that whatever one partner is struggling with, whether it's a substance use or an eating habit or whatever it is, talking to my partner in an open way and in a validating way is going to be one of the most important things for my own well-being. And this is showing me that for pornography use in particular, a lot of people aren't feeling like they can do that. I think the other big piece, and this is the religiosity piece, is that we were finding that people that were reporting high religiosity were more likely to perceive themselves as having an addiction, regardless of what their actual baseline pornography use was. And so what that tells me is that all these issues I've just been talking about not feeling like I'm educated, not feeling like I have a lot of resources, are probably particularly important and relevant for those in religious communities, where we already know that sexual communication tends to be fairly restrictive, particularly in families and in marriages, that for religious individuals, there might be even a heightened sense of feeling like there's nowhere to turn, there's no one I can talk to, that's going to elevate that anxiety.
Well, and with good reason, right? I mean, so in religious communities, we know that even looking at Mormonism, there's oftentimes discipline, or there's outing of someone's story, or if you're with a spouse, there's a lot of meaning attributed to that type of information. So how could you have betrayed me in this way? You're doing something that's very sinful and that maybe has implications for our eternal marriage, quote unquote. So those are very real fears, I think, to have, and why the anxiety kind of makes sense.
Right. And I feel like a lot of those issues are at the cultural level. Like you said, is a lot of that betrayal trauma, which for a lot of, and again, oftentimes there's a gender component here where oftentimes this is a male user, a male spouse that's using, and a female spouse that's reacting to it, is that sometimes that betrayal trauma piece is a very real emotion. But unfortunately, the cultural component is because pornography is not talked about openly, or if it is, it oftentimes is to our youth in a way that's just, this is what you have to avoid, this is sinful behavior, and oftentimes, unfortunately, disengage from any discussion on healthy sexuality. And I think that's another really big piece to this whole conversation, is that oftentimes in religious communities, in the LDS community, pornography becomes a topic in and of itself, and it's disengaged from any discussion with healthy sexuality, when in my view, all of those conversations need to happen simultaneously. That when I'm talking to my children about this issue, I'm not just talking to them about pornography, and I've got 4 kids, and my oldest son is 13, so he's right in that puberty area, and I've certainly had conversations with him about pornography and why I feel like he should be trying to avoid it. But it's not just avoid it because it's sin and it's bad. It's, well, here's what I think healthy sexuality is, and here's what our family believes healthy sexuality can be, and here's how pornography might not promote those particular values. And I think having those broader conversations are really important, and getting our culture to be more open about not just pornography, but sexuality in general, is where a lot of the work needs to happen.
Yeah, and then to take that further, you tend to do this better maybe with other things like the word of wisdom. We tend to talk about healthy bodies and the body being a gift from God. And even then, even though we have values and we all maybe agree on those values, there can be definitely behavioral noncompliance to those values, right? Mm-hmm. So most of us maybe eat too many donuts or have some weight we want to lose or things of that nature. We don't tend to have the same meaning attributed to that if our spouse or if our child comes to us saying, hey, I'm having problems with a healthy relationship with food, as we do the fear and anxiety that comes with a healthy relationship with sexuality. So you mentioned, for example, how do we normalize a normative use of pornography? How do we do that in a culture where there's very little room for that to be legitimate?
Yeah, and I think part of that is a misunderstanding. This is a discussion I have with my students all the time, that oftentimes we use that word normative, and we think, well, normative must mean it's good, because if most people are doing it, then it must be good. And like I said, there's a distinction that has to be made, that normative behavior doesn't mean it's healthy behavior. That most Americans are overweight. That doesn't mean that eating fatty foods is good for us. Like I said earlier, the research that's coming out on pornography suggests that it has a net negative effect on most relationships. There was a meta-analysis that just came out a few months ago that looked across 27 studies, I believe, across 7 or 8 different countries. And it was showing that on average, it was looking at satisfaction, relationship satisfaction, that pornography tends to have that small negative effect on relationships. And so pornography is a great illustration of this idea that pornography use is certainly normative, meaning that particularly for men, most men are going to view pornography at some point in their lives. Most men are going to use or view pornography multiple times in their life. And that goes for religious and non-religious communities. Most LDS young men have viewed pornography multiple times. That's normative. It's what's normal. It doesn't mean that it's healthy. And so there's a disconnect that happens for a lot of people, where it's okay to say that most of us are going to have experience with this and still being able to say that it still can have negative effects. Now, the other added side on the religious front, and this is another really hard thing sometimes for religious individuals to get their head around, is that something can have a spiritual effect on us, even if it doesn't have a temporal effect on us. And if you put this in an LDS context, for example, I use tithing as a good example. If I don't pay my tithing, if I'm a faithful Mormon, the temporal benefit is positive for me, right? I have more money to spend, more resources to spend on my family. But if I'm an active Latter-day Saint, I could look at not paying my tithing as having a negative spiritual consequence on me. And I think that's an important one to keep in mind for pornography as well. Is like I said, even though the research suggests there is this negative effect, it tends to be quite small. And sometimes with members of the church and those in religious communities, we want that effect to be really, really, really negative. And there can be this reaction when the research isn't lining up and isn't showing that it has this massive negative effect, that it might have this small negative effect. And that, again, I go back to my alcohol analogy, that there's a lot of people that drink socially and have a glass of wine and a beer here or there, and it's not really having a massive effect on their lifestyle. But that doesn't necessarily mean, from a Latter-day Saint component or perspective, that doesn't have a spiritual effect on me. And so separating those things is something we oftentimes don't do in the church, but I think is important to do.
Yes, and I think that component is what the research really can't completely separate, because even this net negative of relational negativity, many religions and cultures would have some of these meanings attributed that have to do more with values, and that's understandable. Because I also know that there are net positive research findings for different diagnoses or issues that people are trying to navigate. And we don't need to get into all of that, but it is interesting how our perceptions and our meanings obviously affect how we see a problem. Mm-hmm. Did you control it all for masturbation in this study, or was that not necessarily talked about?
We did not in the study. We did address that. We did ask that in our survey. And one of the things we found, and I've had several discussions actually with other pornography researchers about, we want to try to get into this issue and disentangle it. But the problem we're finding is that, particularly for men, pornography use and masturbation are so highly correlated, it's almost impossible to get them in the same statistical model. I don't want to go into the statistical details because that will put everyone to sleep. But it's almost impossible to get that in there because they're basically the same thing. In other words, when men are looking and using pornography, they're almost always masturbating. It's about 95% overlap there. And so we're still trying to figure out how to disentangle that particular issue. And so that was not in this study.
And what has been the response that you have received? Have you received positive response, pushback, especially coming from a religious entity where I know some of the things that I've read are not very positive? It sounds like they're just wanting to justify pornography use. It sounds like they just want to blah, 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 blah. So what has been your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's like any research on this particular issue. It's been mixed. Most of that mixed response has come, as I said earlier, about misunderstanding, not actually reading the research. And so the fun thing nowadays with research is that you put a study out and then people immediately start to blog and write things up. I know David Lay had a post on Psychology Today where he I think kind of missed the mark, forgetting what the outcomes were, which essentially I've had some conversations with David about that. And some other people, again, like you said, kind of getting angry of, well, this study is just showing that religion is causing pornography problems when, like I said, we didn't really measure pornography problems or relationship outcomes to begin with. So it's been mixed. But for me, the most positive response that I've gotten has actually been, it hasn't been from the media, it hasn't been from bloggers or any kind of outside entities. It's been from the couple emails I've gotten from real people that have come across a blog or come across the study. And it's typically been all the responses I've gotten from young men, young married men, actually, has been most of them, that have been struggling with pornography and have thanked me actually for the study and my grad students and talked about how this helped them to understand that they weren't going through this alone, that they've been, through their young adult life and through their early married life, feeling like they weren't good enough for their spouse, feeling like they couldn't talk to their spouse about this issue. And this research has, in some cases, given them courage to do that. In some cases, just reinforced their decision to be more open with their spouse. And for me, like I said, that's what the take-home message for me was with this article, was to try to promote and try to encourage more of that discussion. And so that's been probably the best feedback that I've gotten that helps validate what I hope the research will do is from those actual on-the-ground people in the marriages that are dealing with this particular issue.
I agree. The personal stories are what matter the most. What would you say Dr. Lay missed in his Psychology Today blog?
I think his biggest thing, and like I said, we had some conversations about the paper, and I thought he was generally pretty accurate about the findings. But one of the things David likes to do is he's one of those on the spectrum of sex addiction, is certainly on the camp of saying that sex addiction is a social construct. And so he wanted to kind of take these findings and say, this is showing that religious individuals are kind of creating their own problem. And again, I don't think the research shows that. One of the things he did conveniently leave out of his blog post was that religious people, that was correlated with perception of addiction, but so was pornography use, independent of religiosity. And so it wasn't just religious people that had this perception of addiction, but the more people were using pornography, the more likely they were also to report addiction. So there's just a couple things where I thought he was overreaching a little bit in terms of trying to use it to dismiss any sense of compulsive behavior around pornography.
Compulsive behavior or addiction behavior. So for example, I tend to not be very much a fan of the addiction language around these types of issues, but I would definitely like to give you an opportunity to share your own perspectives and offer what your ideas are about it. I definitely want to give space for that.
Yeah. Well, it's as someone who spends more time on the research and theory and less, with the actual patients, I actually personally am not very caught up in if the DSM ever puts sexual addiction in as an official diagnosis. And so I don't get as hung up with the addiction versus compulsion language as some of my colleagues do. I mean, I certainly do believe, like a lot of things, that pornography use has the ability to create compulsive use. I think there's enough brain research and other research. Now, a lot of that brain research people tend to take too far, but I think there's enough stuff in there that suggests that there can be some compulsive behavior that interferes with functioning. And for me, those are the two ingredients that I tend to look for in terms of, can something create what we would normally qualify as an addiction is there compulsive use? Is there functional impairment? And I think there's enough evidence that suggests that, again, for a minority of people, and that's the key thing that gets lost in this discussion. This isn't 40, 50, 60% of pornography users. This is 10 to 15% of people that are developing compulsive use. I think that is a very real thing. I think it's something that people are struggling with in a very real way. I think there's a lack of control. That's a very real thing that needs mental health intervention. And so I think it's important to not dismiss that and say, well, pornography is a healthy part of sexuality and we're just creating our own problem. I see enough clinical people. My mom's a clinician, so I talk with her a lot about what she's seeing in her practice. And so I think there's a very real thing that needs to be addressed there, regardless of what we decide to label it.
Yeah, and I would actually agree with, I think, most of what you said. I think most human behavior has the potential to become unhealthy or imbalanced, whether that's substances or video use or eating, gambling. We have all these different behaviors, obviously, that for a smaller amount of the population does tend to get out of balance, and sometimes severely so. My thoughts are more that the addiction model doesn't necessarily help with that, just because of things that we're not necessarily talking about today. So I just want to validate what you're saying, that I do agree that behavior can become compulsive or out of control.
Right. And I think bringing it back to what I said before, is this is another really great area for me where I think nuance is important, is that right now what's happening for so many people on this issue is there's this huge debate of, as you said, is the addiction model the right fit? And we want to apply it for everyone. Where in my view, I think the addiction model might fit for a very small minority of people. And then I think for most people, there's a complete another model that we're not even talking about because we haven't developed it, because we're so focused on what's happening for this 10 or 15% of people that we've lost sight of the other 70 or 80% of people that, like I said earlier, have very little education, very little resources about what this might be doing or what management might look like. And like I think you mentioned earlier, in some cases might lead to secretive use that might then lead them to more compulsive use.
I appreciate you sharing your perspectives for sure. And I think it's just wonderful that we're seeing more and more research being done around all of these issues. Any pushback or any issues around studying these types of topics at BYU? A lot of times people are shocked that this would come out of Brigham Young University, whereas maybe there's a culture there that we need to be more aware of.
No, I mean, that's something I think I'd also like to say that I think is important, is that is another common question I get is, does BYU even let you do this? Are you getting all this pushback from your university or from the church? And I found as a pornography researcher that I felt like to be very supported. I've never gotten any pushback from BYU or the administration or from the church. In fact, I've had several conversations with high up church leadership on this particular issue, and I've always found the general leadership of the church very open to the research and very open, and have actually seen the church, I think, do several things in the last couple of years based on some of those conversations that have been aimed to try to help our culture be more open on this issue. And I think they've taken a lot of really positive steps.
Yeah, just recently, Elder Oaks in an Ensign article talking about pornography offered some type of spectrum approach, right? Yes. Like it's not just everybody becomes an addict or compulsive user.
Yep. And I refer many people to that particular Ensign article, and the church has released several videos and family home evening materials for families that are, not perfect in my mind, but very much in the right direction.
Yeah, and I agree with your ideas of sexual education being so important. How do we talk about these topics? How do we make room for not black and white thinking? How do we make room for not there having to be 100% compliance for this kind of worthiness idea, which I think is very much a part of your damaged goods rhetoric. Right. Because when we rely on behavioral compliance for our entirety of our worthiness, most of us fail at that at some level or another for sure. So, okay, great. So anything else that I'm not asking you that you want to make sure you have a chance to talk about, or that maybe I wouldn't even know to ask because I'm not a researcher?
Right. No, I mean, I think maybe one other thing I'd add, kind of going back to something I said earlier, is for me, this one study is part of this broader discussion I think that's really important to have about, as you were just saying, healthy sexuality. For me, here at BYU, one of the things that's really spurred me into doing a lot of this research is teaching some of my classes. And I teach a big general education lower division class that gets a lot of students from all different parts of the university. And we spend a day talking about sexual intimacy in that class. And I started at one point, as I was getting a lot of questions, reserving a part of that class to just answering questions from the students. So there's not even going to be any lecture material. Just ask me anonymous questions. I let them ask me anonymous questions, and let's answer them. And that 10 or 15 minutes turned into a half hour, and now it's turned into, I have an entire day dedicated just to asking questions about sexuality. And every single semester, I'm struck by questions, and it's not one or two. It's a consistent flow of questions, and it's every single semester of things like, what does an orgasm mean? How does sex even work? I mean, it's questions that suggest to me that the knowledge level about healthy sexuality is extremely low for a lot of these students. And these are educated students coming from educated families. And again, to me, these issues around pornography, as I said earlier, lead into these general issues about sexuality. And I think we need to find more ways to have better conversations with our families, as parents, with our kids around sexuality, and not just on the negative components, not just on the do nots, but also on the do's. One of the things when I do firesides and talks on the law of chastity, I always point out that the law of chastity isn't just a do not list. It's also some do lists. And we don't spend a lot of time talking about the do's and what that means and how that can, I think, enrich not just our perception and our dialogue, but just everything in our lives about how we approach sex.
Do you think that those questions and the level of education that gets presented in these classes for you is correlated to the fact that you are at a religious school? In other words, do you think that that's a trend that happens at all universities where college-age students do have a low level of sexual education, or that that's more the case in maybe more conservative schools?
Yeah, I as someone who taught at the University of Minnesota for several years, it is very different here. There's definitely a religious phenomenon that a lot of these kids that grew up in religious families, again, not that non-religious parents are really open about sexuality a lot of times. A lot of times there's still some barriers there, and you have that awkward talk with your parents. But just the anxiety level around sex tends to be higher in religious families and with religious parents. And so a lot of the students that I see grew up not just with some parents who had kind of awkward conversations with them about sex, but actually a lot of students who never had any conversations with their parents about sex, outside of maybe a family home evening or a Sunday school lesson about the law of chastity in this very broad, general way. And just, never probably felt like they had anywhere to go to ask questions. And I think, like I said, not just the type of questions, but just the amount of questions that I was getting, the fact that I had to dedicate a whole class period to just answering questions on this topic. There was a hunger from these students that were raised in these very religious families they want more information. These were young adults. A lot of them were preparing to get married or newly married couples. And just didn't feel like they had anywhere to turn to ask very basic questions about sex.
Yeah, and it's always such a shame when I hear these reports that I agree with. That's been my experience as well, because I do believe that in Mormonism, we tend to have some really wonderful sex-positive doctrine, and we really, like you're saying, the do's of the law of chastity, that right. We are expected to hopefully have a great relationship with our sexuality and have a great relationship with a partner and really be able to explore that aspect of ourselves in a wonderful way. And so it's sad that the fear and anxiety of the potential sinful aspects of sexuality kind of get in the way of that more open and honest education. I often tease our culture that most of the sexual education we get is when everybody doesn't want you to be having sex, right? It's in your teen years. And that's true of American culture too. It's not just Mormonism. But it's unfortunate that then we don't have more sexual education for people who are adults or married. Any lasting closing thoughts then about your actual research and things that you hope people take away from it, or ongoing projects that you'll be going after this? In other words, does this now spur more research?
Yeah, we're certainly going to keep work in this area. Our next project is actually going to get into some of the couple dynamics. So we're in the process of finishing up a data collection where we're looking at matched couples. One of the things we have almost none of in this particular area of research is data from both partners. So most of the research we have on relationship outcomes is based on one person reporting, here's my use and here's how I think my relationship is going. And so we've got almost 200 couples now where we've got information from both couples. And so we're going to use that to try to get at how pornography is affecting relationships. But then also for the first time, we're going to be able to look at, does secrecy matter? So if the husband's using, but the wife doesn't know he's using, how does that affect the relationship? Does it affect it differently? Vice versa? What if couples are using together? So we're going to be able to get into much more of the couple dynamic stuff that we haven't been able to get at before.
Okay. And it sounds like majorly heterosexual marriages then is what you're going to be looking at.
Yes. Yep. This is what we're focused on, heterosexual couples.
Okay, wonderful. I look forward to that. Maybe I'll reach out and see if you'll talk to me again in the future. That would be great. Well, I know you have another appointment to get to in a few minutes, so I just want to thank you so much for your time and your willingness to come on the show and share with us, I think, some really important aspects of looking at this, both within and without of our Mormon culture. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up extraordinary. It's nothing ordinary, love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.